to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be going over the basics of React. So what is React? Well, it's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And I know that can sound a little bit vague, but bear with me here for a second and we will build up a more concrete definition. So let's start by looking at some key characteristics of React. So first, it is going to be declarative. And what this means is that we describe what the UI needs to look like, and we don't describe all of the implementation details. Next, it is going to be component-based. A component is simply a reusable piece of the user interface, and we can think of this sort of like building our own custom HTML tags. And finally, there's going to be a unidirectional data flow. So what this really means is that React is going to be dynamic. It is going to respond to changes in some data, and that response is going to actually update the DOM. And the way this works is in one direction. So generally speaking, data is going to flow from parent elements down to children, but it doesn't necessarily flow in the other direction. Now that said, there are ways to send data back in the other direction, and we will see all of this and more throughout the idea of being component-based. So a component is not something specific to React, it is a concept that we see in a lot of frameworks and libraries. So what I want to do on this page, we have this progress indicator on the top, a few different controls, and then we have all of the different questions. So now the question is, looking at this user interface, what are the different components? Well, this is a little bit subjective. You can say that different things are or aren't components, and it's up to the individual implementer as to what they actually make be a component. But generally speaking, any of the reusable pieces of the user interface need to be components, as well as just any self-contained pieces of the interface. So first of all, I would say that we can break this page into two primary components. We have this top section here, and this is going to be the component for our progress indicator. And then we have this larger component below it with all of the different interview questions. And now inside of each of these components, there are going to be subcomponents, so components that are nested within them. So for the progress indicator, we have the actual progress bar at the top here, and you could maybe include this text above it as being part of that progress indicator, or you could make them two separate components. So for example, if AlgoExpert had a progress indicator somewhere else on the website, but that wasn't necessarily about how many questions have been completed, then it might actually make sense for this text to not be part of this progress bar component. Or of course, we could say it is all one component, and the text above it might be a prop, so essentially like a parameter to that component. And then we have these two buttons below the progress bar. We could say there's a component containing both of them, or maybe they are just separate components, and maybe we even have a button component below that is a sort of base level component. See these main components and what they could be. Okay, so now let's move on to the bottom section. We have the group by category and group randomly tabs at the top. So I would say we likely have a tab bar component here, and we might even have a tab bar item component as well for each of the individual buttons. And then below that, we likely have another one of these container components that would contain all of the different interview questions. And then each group of interview questions is likely a component as well. So for example, we have this CSS interview questions component, and it would have all 5 of these different CSS questions in it. And this is going to be the first component we have that is clearly being reused. So we have 4 different groups of interview questions, and these would each be the same component, just with different props as we call them in React, or simply different parameters. And then each of these components also has a list of other components, so a list of these individual interview questions, and we could consider each one of these interview question boxes to be its own component as well. And of course, this would once again be a reusable component that is going to have the name of the interview question, as well as maybe some other data like if the question has been completed yet, as a parameter, or again, as we call it in React, a prop, which we will see later on in the crash course. And now that's really how we would break down this website into its components. That's not to say that these are the only possible components you could see here, there's an argument you could make for there being different components in different places, and as an implementer of this website, you could choose what components you do and don't want to create, but hopefully this gave you a general idea of how you can break down a web page into its components. Okay, so now what I want to do is move on to look at some code so we can understand how these React components are going to be implemented. So React components usually use what we call JSX, or JavaScript XML. So this is a JavaScript syntax extension for inlining HTML, or more generally, any XML elements. Now, JSX is not React specific. It actually is used by some other frameworks, such as Vue has support for JSX, but when we use it with React, it is going to compile into some React code, and we will look at that in a moment. But the idea is pretty simple. We can use what looks like HTML inside of our JavaScript. This isn't a string or anything of that nature. It is inlined just as it is because it is a syntax extension. So for example here, we have this constant which we set to hello, and we set this equal to an element, which is JSX, and it is a paragraph element, so a p tag with hello world inside of it. And then you can see we have the semicolon at the end here, because this is still a JavaScript expression. So this is a line of JavaScript using the JSX syntax extension. Okay, so then what does this JSX actually compile into? How does this become JavaScript that the browser can interpret? Well, to understand this, let's look at another example. Here we have a constant called element, and it is a p tag again that says hello world. But this one also has an ID of hello, and it has an emphasis tag around the text of world. You'll also notice that we are wrapping the element in parentheses. We do this just to create a multi-line JavaScript expression. And now all this is going to compile into is a function that is part of React called createElement. This is very similar to document.createElement, but rather than creating a DOM node, this creates a React element, and that element can later be appended to the DOM, and we will see that in a moment. But for now, let's take a look at this createElement function that our JSX is compiling into. So the first parameter to createElement is going to be the type of the element, and in this case it is a paragraph, so the p tag. And the second parameter is going to be optional, but this is the props. So props are going to be an object, and these are going to be any of the attributes that are added to the element. So in this case, we have the ID of hello, so the key is ID, and the value is the string of hello. And then next, we have a rest parameter. So this allows createElement to take in multiple extra parameters, and these are going to be the children. So the first child is this string of hello, and you'll notice there's a space at the end of the string because there is some white space separating the text of hello from the second child, which is going to be the emphasis tag. And now that second child, since it is another tag, is going to be another call to react.createElement. So this one is going to create an emphasis tag, so the em tag. The props are going to be null because there are no attributes in the tag. And then finally, the only child of this nested call to react.createElement is going to be the text of world. And that's all there is to it. That is how the compiler is going to convert JSX syntax into standard JavaScript. And of course, this react.createElement function is also a standard JavaScript function provided by React. Now, one small note here is that we usually won't directly call react.createElement. We almost never actually use this function directly because we are going to use JSX syntax, but it can be good to know what your JSX code is going to be compiled into. Okay, so now the final step is going to be to take this React element that we just created and actually put it on the DOM. And the way we do this is by using another package known as React DOM. This package is very simple. It only contains a few public functions, and the main one that we are going to use is going to be React DOM.render. And all this does is it takes in a React element, so some element we created using JSX, and then it takes in the DOM container. So essentially we are going to append our element inside of this DOM container. You will oftentimes see just an empty div here, which will serve as the root of the application, but you could also have this be some deeper nested DOM container if you only want part of the page to be using React. Okay, so now finally, we said that we want to make reusable components, but up to this point, all we've seen is JSX. And we've seen that we can save this JSX in a variable, and sure, we could reuse that variable, but really what we want to do is make functional components. So functional components are simply functions that are going to return a React element. So they are going to return some JSX. So if we look at the left here, we have this sayHello function. And all this function does is it returns the JSX of the paragraph hello world. And this sayHello function, while it is a standard function, is a function component. You will also notice that with this function name, rather than camel casing, we use Pascal casing, so we have a capital S. And this is actually very important, and we will see this in a moment. So if we come over to the screenshot on the right here, we have another functional component, and this one is called app. And app returns a div, and inside of this div, we actually use the sayHello component. So you'll notice we don't directly call the sayHello function. Instead, what we do is we treat it as another element. And in this case, it's going to be a self-closing tag. We'll see how to add children later on in the crash course. But you can see we just add sayHello like any other element. And this is why the Pascal casing is important. Whenever the first letter of the tag name is a capital letter, that indicates that it is a custom component, whereas a lowercase letter indicates that it is a standard HTML tag. So for example, below sayHello, we have another paragraph that says welcome to React, and that paragraph tag is in lowercase because of the fact that that is a standard HTML tag. Now, one small caveat that I did want to mention is that not all custom components are going to be functions. We can actually make custom components using classes as well. However, this is more of an older syntax that you don't see too often anymore, but we will show this later on in the crash course. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and move over to the code editor and do a quick demo of how we can create a React application and create our first components. Okay, so now we're here in the code editor, and you can see we have an empty editor, as well as we have the browser open, and we just have a "this site cannot be reached" error because we have not created our website yet. So to create a React app, there's a variety of ways we can do it, and we will see a bunch of these throughout the crash course, but the most common one is going to be to use create React app. So to do this, we will type npx into the terminal, and this is a command that comes with Node.js. So if you get a command not found, make sure that you have Node.js installed on your machine, and then we can say create React app, and we simply give it a name. So I will call this test app. We can click enter, and it will start creating our React application. Okay, so now this is done, and we can see that it created this test app directory, and it's giving us some suggestions, the first one being to change directories into that test application, and then to run npm start. So we can go ahead and do that. I will say cd test app, and this will change directories into the test application directory, and then we can run npm start, which is going to be the command to start running the application on localhost. So we can say npm start, And now you can see the browser has actually loaded this website, which is the template that comes with Create React App. Okay, but now let's come over here to the sidebar and actually open this up and look at all of the different directories and files that were created for us. So first we have the node modules, which is going to contain all of the dependencies that were downloaded. If you've worked with any other projects using the node package manager, this is the exact same thing. And the only key point with node modules is just that you almost never need to even open it. You never need to do anything manual with node modules. And then we have this public directory. Now, Create React App is going to use Webpack, and Webpack is essentially going to ignore the public directory. So this is basically going to contain vanilla files that we need to send to the browser. Now, it's worth noting that the setup of a public directory has nothing to do with React specifically. This is just how Create React App sets up the directories. So this is very common just because Create React App is so common, but there's nothing in React that requires you to have this public directory set up in this way. Okay, so in this public directory, first we have the favicon, which is the icon the browser will show as the icon for the website. And of course, you would want to change this to your own icon. And then we have the index.html file. So this is the main file of our website. And for the most part, it is just standard HTML. So if we come over here, we can see that first we have a meta tag to set the character set to UTF-8. And then we link in the favicon. The one note here is that you'll see that we use this %, public_URL, and then another %. So this is how we can reference files in this public directory. Next, we have the viewport meta tag, which allows us to use media queries to scale our page to smaller screen sizes. And then we also have this theme color meta tag down here. You don't need to include this, you can just delete it. But what a theme color is it is the main color of your website. And some browsers, specifically mobile browsers, will actually use this to change things like the color of the tab. And then we have a description. You would want to update this description to have the content of a description of your own page. We also have an Apple Touch icon link, which is very similar to a favicon, but it is the icon that iPhones will use if a user saves your website to their home screen. And similarly, we also link in a manifest file, which is another way of saying if the user saves your website, what should the icons be and what should the names be, and so on and so forth. So we can actually open up the manifest.json file that it links to, and you can see it is just JSON with a name, a short name, these icons, and a few other settings. We aren't going to go too in depth on this. Most of the time, this isn't going to be too important, and it's really not anything specific to React. It is just in the HTML template that is given to us. Next, we can scroll down and you can see all we have left is the title. So this is going to be just like any other title tag, and we want to update this to be the title of our website. And then we come down to the body. So the body only has two tags in it. First, a no script tag, which just tells the user if they have JavaScript disabled that they need to enable JavaScript. That can be one negative of working with React, in that if the user does have JavaScript disabled for any reason, then they likely won't see almost any of your user interface. And then we have this div with the ID of root. So this is going to be the root of the application, and we will see in a moment, this is going to be the DOM node that we actually append our root React element to. Okay, so now the rest of the public directory isn't too important. We have some logos that are associated with this template application, so most of the time you just want to delete those. We also have this robots.txt file. This simply tells robots, such as the ones used by the Google search engine, how to treat your website, but we can close that out for now. And now let's open up the src or source directory, which is going to be the main directory that we work in. Now, when Create React App initially creates the directory, there isn't going to be any organization inside of the source directory, but I would recommend finding some way to organize this better, or else this directory will simply balloon like crazy. So we usually end up having one component per JavaScript file, and then some organizational structure to make it easier to find those different files. Okay, but anyways, first of all, we have app.css, which is simply a CSS file. We also have app.js, which is going to be our first component. We will come back to this in a moment. We have a test file for app as well. You can delete this if you don't need it, but it does show you how to start writing some tests, so it can be useful. And then, of course, you can add more tests as you create your application. And then we have index.css, which is another CSS file. And then we have index.js, which is going to be the entry point of our application. So let's take a look at what this index.js file is actually doing. So first we have some imports. So we import React as well as React DOM, and we import this index.css file. So whenever we want to use a CSS file, this is usually what we do. We just import it like this. And then we also import the app component, as well as we import this report web vitals function, which we will look at in a moment. So just like we saw earlier, we use React DOM.render to actually put some React on the page. And in this case, we are appending to document.getElementById of root, which is the root from index.html. So that is this div here. And we are appending this JSX, so this React element. Now we will talk more about React.strict mode later on. This is very similar to use strict in JavaScript, but it is React specific and makes it easier to find some bugs. And then we have our app. And just to show you, we can put any JSX here. So for example, I could have div hello here. I could save this and you'd see the browser updates and we just have the div with hello. You'll also see in the terminal, Webpack actually gives us a warning, which is very nice, to tell us that we never used app. So I imported app on line 4, but we aren't using it anymore because instead we use this div with the text of hello. But I will go ahead and undo this to put app back. And now the warning will go away and we have app displayed on the screen once again. Now this report web vitals function, we don't really need. We can just delete it. And oftentimes you will, but this is something that comes with Create React App if you want to measure some performance. So to show you how this works, we can simply say console.log here, save this, and now we can come over to the browser and open up the console, and you will see that it actually logs out some objects, and these objects are going to give us some performance metrics. So for example, this first log here is telling us how long the first contentful paint took. Oftentimes I do end up just removing this report web vitals function, but it can be useful occasionally. But anyways, let's come over to app.js and take a look at this component. So this is the main component that is currently being rendered. You can see we have this div with the class name of app, and then we have the header, which has an image in it. One thing to note with images is that we set the source equal to whatever we import. So we import the image up here and we call it logo, and we set the source equal to that variable. And then we also have a class name here, as well as an alt attribute. You will notice we use class name instead of class like we do with standard HTML. This is because class is actually a reserved word in JavaScript, and at the end of the day, this is just JavaScript. So JSX uses class name instead of class, but we will talk about this more in depth in the video on JSX. Anyways, we then have a paragraph as well as this link, and then the end of the header. But of course, we could change this to be anything we want, so I will go ahead and delete all of this, and maybe we want instead to have the paragraph that is hello world. We can save this, and you can see we now have this hello world text that is being centered, likely because of something in the class name of app. If I got rid of this, it is no longer going to be centered. You will also notice that we are exporting the app, so this is how we are able to import it in index.js. We could also add other components here. So for example, we could say function say hello like we saw earlier, and this would be a function that just returns this paragraph here. So we can copy this paragraph and return it like this. And then instead of this paragraph, we could say hello, and this would do the exact same thing. We could even have multiple copies of this. So we can say hello twice, and we get 2 copies of hello world. Now we will go much more in depth on components throughout the crash course, But for now, I hope that gives you a good basic idea of how this is working. To go ahead and show the rest of the files that are given to us by Create React App, let's come over here, and you can see, first of all, we have that logo that was being imported, so you would likely want to delete that. And then we have the actual implementation of the report web vitals function, so you can see what it is actually reporting on. And then we have this setup tests file, which is going to be a file that if you do choose to use the default testing setup, is going to run before any of your tests run. So by default, this just has this one import in it, but you could add some extra setup in this file. And next we also have this git ignore. So Create React App automatically creates a Git repository as well, and it comes with this git ignore so that you don't accidentally commit extra files that you don't need to be tracked by the Git repository. And then we have the package lock and the package.json, which are the standard files that come with any Node application. And then finally, we also have a README, so this comes by default, and it has some nice links how you can get started with Create React App and how everything is working. So if you're ever trying to figure out what the purpose of some file is, or what command you need to run, there's a good chance it is in this README. So with that said, I hope this video gave you a good idea of how to use Create React App, some of the pros and cons of it. I think the major con is that it does sort of create a lot of files that you might not need, and you might have to go in manually to delete those, such as the extra images that it gives you, but it does save you a ton of time in setting up a React application. I also hope this gave you a good basic idea of how to start creating components, and with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something new. I'll see you in the next one.